But here's the question: is it correct to say that the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, failed? And if that's the case, why? What are some of the factors that you think it couldn't sustain itself? In general, if you're thinking about over the region.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question. If you take a bird's eye view, let's say at Egypt, the current regime has total control over all governmental institutions and the media. The crackdown is worse than ever. There are over 60,000 political prisoners in jail. But I think we should go beyond defeat as the main event of the revolution, because if we see a revolution as a process, then I think what failed was the revolution taking power, but the overarching defeat created waves of political and social transformations that I would say changed Egypt forever, changes for the worse and for the better. But contrary to the popular narrative, I don't think things went back to the way they were before, because this implies we're on the same trajectory, that we're on the same line going back and forth. I think that we're in a whole different terrain. Like January set in place some drastic changes that were not linear. And we need to understand those changes to see what is happening now. For example, the first part, for example, like January succeeded in Egypt in ending Mubarak's project of grooming, giving Egypt to his son Gamal, and not only his son, but handing it over to the business class and fully entrenching the neoliberal changes that had been started before him by Sadat. That project failed. We don't know if it would have been better than military rule, but it's not what we have. I think another area that January succeeded is it created a vocabulary of emancipation that we use to this very day. And it gave us a lens through which we can talk about and discuss what is happening, what is going on. So I think we can consider what happened as a starting point that changed the historical trajectory of Egypt and the wider region. And we can think about how it can inspire us moving forward. And back to the title of this talk, if we say that the revolution is deferred, would we even want to complete it as it was? I think if you ask the people who are at the front and center of these revolutions or uprisings, I think they'd probably say they would take a different approach. They wouldn't continue on the same path.
And who was at the front and center of these protests, not thinking just of the individuals that spearheaded it, but broadly trying to understand what was the class character of the Arab Spring, which granted would probably be different across the region, but something that I've often realized is that I'm quite ignorant about who the primary constituency of the Arab Spring as a whole was.
Yeah, so I mean, an accumulation of dissent led up to 2011. In Egypt, there was a general strike in 2008 that was started in like industrial working class stronghold Mahalla that made its way to Tahrir. Sorry, not to Tahrir, but to Cairo. But these protests weren't seen as overtly political. They were seen as economic protests, but like they paved the way up to 2011. But the special thing or the peculiar, like no one would say that the image of that 2011 had like this pristine image of a revolution led by the working class. That wasn't true. There was no one group, no one character, not one class that that were considered the primary constituency of the revolution. There are a lot of, I mean, that is shown through the slogan "Aish Hurriya Adala Ijtimaiya," bread, freedom, and social justice. You can see how there were economic demands, there were political demands, and there were demands for social justice. And that was that made itself manifest in Tahrir Square itself, when you could see there were these open democratic conversations being had by all of these different groups, and they were made public. And There were talks, there were like symposiums happening in the square in a very democratic way. And I think that was the special character of those 18 days that the wider public and like people around the world saw as very special.
Sean, you're on mute. As this always happens, Sean. You really need to be more vigilant.
The absent-minded professor. No. So my follow-up question to that is, so initially, of course, as you said, it's the square full of people. There are all these different demands, but what clearly then emerges is that there's one group that began to take a lead, and eventually they would, when there's an election, they would come to power. How does one explain kind of that, like the role of political Islam? And I mean, of course, the specific example here is Egypt, right, where the Brotherhood emerges as kind of the major political formation, and they come to power. In the same way, there's also, and maybe it would be interesting to contrast that, in Tunisia, there's also Islamic parties or Islamist parties who get most of the votes. They also come to power, and we see two different kinds of things. Like we see almost, if you want, like two different processes playing out. Can you just say a little bit about that nature of something that was part of the politics of the spring? Yeah.
So in Egypt, for example, in a country like Egypt, there has been an erosion of opposition for decades and decades. That maybe even started with Nasser, with there not being, not allowing leftists to emerge other than the main party. Under Sadat actually allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to exist, to overpower the Nasserists and push down the Nasserists, which is funny because they ended up killing him. And then afterwards, this continued with Mubarak. Muslim Brotherhood were still given political currency in a way that other political currents like Nasserists and leftists were not. And even if the state kept a close eye on them, put them in prisons and stuff, but they were still allowed to exist in a way that other political organizations weren't. So in the lead up to the revolution, then when we come to the revolution, we have all of these people in the square with differing political opinions, but we have one group that is organized, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood. So when sudden elections that happen after a very short period of time with no organization, and no one else that has like a name, that has made a name for themselves, like Muslim Brotherhood, then it's not surprising that the Muslim Brotherhood take power.